Imagine discovering a secret so devastating, so earth-shaking, that it makes you question everything you thought you knew about one of the most famous tragedies in modern history. Now imagine that the person uncovering this truth isn't an outsider, a journalist, or a conspiracy theorist, but Diana's own brother. What would push Charles Spencer, a man who has guarded his sister's memory with religious devotion for nearly 3 decades, to finally speak about the one detail he swore he'd never reveal? And more importantly, why now? These are the questions that explode into the story you're about to hear. A story that feels less like a recollection of the past and more like a fuse being lit beneath the present, threatening to detonate every assumption, every silence, and every carefully curated version of events the world has been fed for years. And here's the part nobody wants to admit. If these revelations are true, even partially, even symbolically, the consequences wouldn't just ripple through the monarchy, they'd tear through the very foundation of how we understand Diana's final hours. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. But let's slow down for just a moment. Ask yourself this. If you held a piece of information capable of rewriting history, would you share it? Would you risk your reputation, your relationships, your safety? Would you challenge the most powerful institution in your country simply because your conscience refused to stay quiet any longer? Most people would say yes. Almost nobody actually would. And that's why what Charles Spencer is doing, in this fictionalized retelling, resonates so deeply. Because the truth he reveals doesn't feel like a footnote. It feels like a confession, a reckoning, and a warning wrapped into one. It starts with something deceptively simple, a letter. A letter that shouldn't exist. A letter that was never supposed to resurface. A letter that Diana wrote in the weeks before her death. A letter her brother locked away, sealed in a drawer where it remained untouched, unseen, and unspoken about for decades. Why keep something like that hidden? Why keep something that important buried? According to Charles, it wasn't because he wanted to protect the monarchy or shield anyone from blame. No, it was something much more human. He wanted to protect her legacy, her peace, her children, her memory. But now, years later, he claims circumstances have shifted in such a disturbing way that staying silent no longer feels like protection, it feels like betrayal. And that's where this story ignites. Because when Charles Spencer breaks his silence, he doesn't do it politely. He doesn't do it carefully. He doesn't do it diplomatically. He does it like a man who has been holding his breath for far too long, and who finally exhales a truth heavy enough to shake the walls of Buckingham Palace. And whether the palace chooses to acknowledge it or not, this new revelation, in our dramatized retelling, sends King Charles into a spiral. A private one, a controlled one, but a spiral nonetheless. The kind where the room grows quiet after he speaks. The kind where aides exchange uneasy glances. The kind where old fears resurface like ghosts he thought he'd buried. So why now? Why this moment? Why this story resurfacing with such ferocity? The answer, in this fictional narrative, isn't a single event, it's a chain reaction. An anniversary, a resurfaced document, a journalist asking the wrong question at the wrong time, a growing tension inside palace walls, a moral dilemma Charles Spencer can no longer ignore. And underlying it all, the lingering belief that Diana never truly received justice. Not in the public eye, not in the court of opinion, not in the echoing silence of unanswered questions. As we move through this introduction, picture yourself standing in the middle of a storm, not the kind that destroys buildings, but the kind that destroys illusions. The kind that makes you rethink every official statement, every televised tribute, every carefully constructed narrative. Because when Charles Spencer speaks, he doesn't just recount memories. He doesn't just share anecdotes. He opens a door that many hoped would stay closed. And the shadows behind that door are colder, darker, and far more unsettling than anyone expected. Now, before we dive deeper, let's address the obvious tension that looms over this entire story: the monarchy's relationship with the truth. The palace has always mastered the art of silence, of controlled narratives, of strategic omissions. They understand better than anyone that perception is power. But there's one thing they cannot fully control: the past. And the past, as it turns out, has teeth. Sharp ones. Ones that bite back when you least expect it. So when Charles Spencer comes forward with new details, in this fictional universe, the palace doesn't take it lightly. They react the only way they know how, with panic masked as poise, concern disguised as confidence, and anger buried beneath protocol. But let's bring this closer to you. Right now, sitting here, listening to this unfolding mystery, ask yourself, why does this matter? Why does a decades-old tragedy still spark such intense fascination, such emotional reactions, such visceral debate? Is it because Diana was beloved? Yes. Is it because her death was surrounded by confusion? Absolutely. But deeper than that, it's because Diana represented something the monarchy never quite understood: authenticity, vulnerability, humanity. She was flawed, open, real. And the idea that someone like her may have sensed danger, may have felt watched, may have voiced fears that were dismissed, that idea is unbearable. It gnaws at the public consciousness like a story with a missing final chapter. And that's exactly what Charles Spencer's revelation promises: a missing chapter, a page torn from the book, a detail that reframes everything. And while this story is fictionalized for dramatic purposes, the emotional weight behind it still hits with full force. Because even in fiction, Diana's legacy carries a gravity that pulls you in. You can't look away. You don't want to. You want answers, even hypothetical ones. You want closure, even imagined closure. You want to feel, even briefly, that justice exists in some form, in some universe, somewhere. As the introduction continues, let's reconstruct the moment Charles Spencer opens the drawer where the letter has been hiding. Picture the room. Dim, quiet, filled with a stillness that feels almost sacred. He hesitates before touching the envelope. His hand trembles slightly, not from fear, but from memory. All the weight he's carried sits on his shoulders in that instant. Every interview he didn't give, every rumor he didn't address, every truth he didn't tell. And when he finally lifts the letter, it's as if time folds in on itself, bringing him back to the last conversation he had with his sister. Back to the moment she confided something that unsettled him so deeply he tried to dismiss it, tried to rationalize it, tried to bury it within himself. But time is merciless. It doesn't care about your grief. It doesn't care about your secrets. It doesn't care about your intentions. It marches forward until the day arrives when the truth, even a fictional truth, demands to be heard. This is the day. This is the moment. This is where the story shifts from memory to revelation. And that revelation, according to this dramatized account, doesn't just implicate a nameless figure or an obscure advisor. It points toward the monarchy itself, not as villains, but as architects of an environment where dangers were underestimated, warnings were ignored, and consequences were catastrophic. Now pause. Think. Really think. What would you do if you felt your loved one was wronged? What would you do if the official version of events contradicted the private fears you heard with your own ears? What would you do if your sister, a global icon, whispered something so chilling that it kept you awake for years afterward? Would you stay silent? Would you protect the powerful? Would you bury the story out of fear? Or would you tell the world? Because that's what Charles Spencer, in our fictional story, finally chooses: truth over silence, memory over reputation, conscience over convenience. But this choice doesn't come without consequences. And the first domino to fall is King Charles himself. The moment he hears that Charles Spencer is speaking out, something within him fractures. Not because he's guilty of wrongdoing in this fictional narrative, but because he fears how the world will interpret the slightest suggestion of impropriety. He fears the resurrection of narratives he spent decades trying to escape. He fears the return of a public judgment that does not forgive, does not forget, and does not care about nuance. And when fear grips a monarch, especially one still navigating the shadows of his past, the reactions can be explosive. Behind closed doors, his composure slips. His voice rises. His frustration spills over. And for a split second, he becomes not a king, but a man terrified that his past will consume his present. Advisors scramble. Camilla tries to calm him. But the tension is undeniable. Something is cracking. Something is unraveling. Something is moving beneath the surface that none of them can fully control. And what's worse, this is only the beginning. Because the letter, the one Charles Spencer finally opens, contains a line so haunting, so unervingly specific, that it threatens to unravel everything the monarchy has tried to maintain. And that line leads directly into Chapter 1, a revelation, a warning, a detail so jarring that once you hear it, you'll never look at Diana's final days the same way again. Not in this fictional universe, not in any universe. And it all begins with 5 words she wrote that no one was ever supposed to read. But what those words were, and why they matter now, that's a truth Charles Spencer is about to reveal. And what comes next will change everything, and no one saw it coming. What were those 5 words Diana wrote that no one was ever supposed to read? And why did they terrify her brother so much that he buried the letter for decades? That's the question hanging in the air like a storm cloud as we step into this next chapter. And the truth is, even in a fictional universe, some sentences hit with a force you can almost feel in your chest. So let me ask you this. If you opened a letter written by someone you loved, someone gone, someone iconic, someone whose life ended in a way the world still struggles to accept, and you saw a warning that felt more like a prophecy, what would you do? Would you keep reading? Would you stop? Would you crumble? Because the moment Charles Spencer sees that line again, after years of trying to forget it, something inside him doesn't just stir, it breaks. The envelope is still in his hand, creased from the pressure of his grip. The room around him feels too quiet, too still, like the air is waiting. You know that feeling when a memory hits so raw and so unexpectedly that you don't even breathe? That's where he is. Frozen, suspended, caught between the past he lived and the present he can no longer ignore. The last time he read these words, Diana was still alive. The last time he held this letter, he told himself he shouldn't take it seriously, that she was emotional, exhausted, overwhelmed, imagining threats that weren't really there. But now, standing in a world that has changed and yet hasn't changed at all, he realizes something he didn't want to admit back then. Maybe she wasn't imagining anything. Maybe she was warning him. Maybe she sensed something he refused to see. And this is where the contradiction hits you. Because Charles Spencer is not a man who scares easily. He's not a man who folds under pressure. He's not a man who shies away from truth. But he is a man who loved his sister more fiercely than the public ever understood. And that love comes with weight, guilt, regret, unanswered questions. The kind that doesn't fade. The kind that grows louder with time. So what exactly did Diana write? What were the 5 words that hollowed out Charles Spencer's chest the moment he saw them? I fear they want me gone. Simple, short, but devastating. And here's where things get complicated. Diana was known for her emotional honesty. Brutally so. She confided everything, sometimes too much, sometimes too quickly. But this sentence, this wasn't like her usual expressions of fear or frustration. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't embellished. It was blunt, final, almost resigned, as if she wasn't asking for help. She was documenting a truth she believed wouldn't be addressed until after her death. Now, before we go further, pause with me. Think. Don't gloss over the emotional gravity here. Imagine your sister writes that. Imagine reading it and brushing it off because you think she's overwhelmed by pressure, by paparazzi, by relentless scrutiny. Imagine telling yourself she just needs rest. Imagine convincing yourself she'll be fine, only for her to die weeks later in a tragedy that still feels like a wound across the entire planet. Wouldn't you question everything you dismissed? Wouldn't you wonder if that letter wasn't just emotional, but insightful? Wouldn't you feel haunted? That's the emotional starting point of this chapter. Because once Charles Spencer reopens this letter, once he sees that line, he's forced to confront the possibility that ignoring it back then might have been the biggest mistake of his life. And here's where the story deepens. Because the letter doesn't stop there. The warning is only the beginning. Diana writes about pressure, surveillance, whispers she couldn't identify. People shifting around her, watching her, advising her in ways that didn't feel like support but containment. And again, remember, this is fictional storytelling, but the psychological realism hits hard. Diana's life was a hurricane of attention, agendas, manipulation, and misunderstanding. In this dramatized telling, her letter reads like the cry of someone caught in a tidal wave, someone trying desperately to hold on to her sense of truth before it was washed away. Charles Spencer reads the letter once, then again, then a third time. Each time, the words feel heavier, as if they're not ink on a page, but fingerprints of a ghost pressing into his memory. And that's when it happens. The moment the fear he's tried to suppress for nearly 30 years finally breaks through. Because the letter mentions something he forgot until now. A detail so small he dismissed it at the time, but now blazes like a warning flare. Diana wrote, "They said I'm becoming a problem." Who said it? She doesn't specify. She never names names. But in the context of her letter, it wasn't the press. It wasn't publicists. It wasn't friends or enemies or rumors. It was someone close. Someone inside the institution surrounding her. Someone with access. And that's when the contradiction surfaces, the kind of emotional contradiction that makes stories like this irresistible. Diana felt endangered, but she also felt strangely calm about it. It's as if she had accepted something Charles Spencer couldn't understand. As if she had made peace with the idea that her life was spiraling into territories she couldn't control. Let me ask you, have you ever known someone who sensed their own ending long before anyone else did? A friend who said something you laughed off, only to realize later it was a sign? A warning? A whisper of fate? That's what this letter feels like. Not paranoia. Not drama. Intuition. Now imagine Charles Spencer trying to process all this while the world outside believes everything ended tragically, but cleanly. Officially. Case closed. Nothing more to see. But is any story ever really that simple? This is where the first real twist emerges, the one Charles Spencer never intended to reveal. The letter he opened wasn't the only one Diana wrote during that period. There were drafts, scribbles, notes on scraps of paper. He didn't keep all of them, but he remembers one fragment, a fragment he couldn't find when he reopened his archives. A sentence that always bothered him. They want control back. Control of what? Her public image? Her relationships? Her independence? Her plans? The letter doesn't say, but the implication is enough to send ripples through the room. So now you have a brother staring at the one warning he kept hidden, realizing it contains pieces of a puzzle he never had the courage to assemble. And maybe that's why he reacts so intensely now. Because he's older, because he's not afraid of public fallout, because he's watched public memory distort, because he's realized silence can be more damaging than truth. And in this fictional retelling, Charles Spencer doesn't just feel guilt. He feels responsibility, maybe even duty. Because the world has never fully understood the layers surrounding Diana's final months, the tension, the loneliness, the shifting alliances, the quiet fears she expressed privately. And this letter doesn't solve those mysteries, but it sharpens them. And here comes the contradiction you weren't expecting. Charles Spencer isn't angry at the monarchy. He isn't vengeful. He isn't vindictive. What he feels, and what he admits in this fictional universe, is sadness. Deep, aching sadness. Because the letter reopens his grief like a wound that never healed. He realizes Diana didn't just feel danger, she felt abandoned. Misunderstood, dismissed, and that's a pain no brother forgets. Now, let's connect this to the palace. Because while Charles Spencer is reading the letter in private, someone inside the palace has already heard whispers that something is coming. Something big, something messy, something that could reignite dormant storms. And that someone goes straight to King Charles. And when he hears the news, that Spencer is talking, that a letter exists, that old fears might resurface, he reacts in a way that startles everyone in the room. Not with anger, but with sheer panic. Because in this fictional retelling, King Charles isn't afraid of being blamed. He's afraid of being misunderstood again. He's afraid the world will twist events, create villains, distort motives, and reignite the firestorm that consumed his life decades ago. And the idea of that, even the possibility, sends him spiraling. So now you have two men shaken by the same letter, for completely different reasons. One grieving, one panicking, both trapped in the shadows of a woman the world still mourns. And this, right here, is where the real tension begins. Because Charles Spencer hasn't told the public what the rest of the letter says. He hasn't revealed the detail that truly terrified him. The line that reframes everything. The one thing that made him realize he couldn't stay silent anymore. And that detail? It doesn't point to a person. It points to a moment. A precise moment Diana wrote down. A moment she said would explain everything, if anything ever happened to her. And what that moment was, that's the secret he's about to reveal next. What was the moment Diana claimed would explain everything, if anything ever happened to her? That's the question dragging us straight into this chapter. And trust me, once you hear it, You'll understand why Charles Spencer's hands shook when he realized what he'd overlooked for nearly 3 decades. So let's begin with the mini hook you deserve. What if the key to understanding Diana's final hours wasn't the crash, the paparazzi, or the tunnel, but something that happened more than a day earlier, something so ordinary on the surface that the world never bothered to question it? That's the twist. That's the contradiction. That's the beginning of a timeline that Charles Spencer, in this fictional world, now realizes was never as clean as the public was told. But let me ask you, have you ever revisited a memory years later and suddenly noticed something you completely missed? A gesture? A tone? A strange detail that didn't matter before, but changes everything now? That's exactly what Charles Spencer experiences when he looks back at the date Diana wrote down, a date he dismissed at the time because he didn't understand its significance. The moment she identified wasn't a heated argument. It wasn't a dramatic confrontation. It wasn't even anything that would have struck someone as unusual. It was a meeting, a private one she wasn't supposed to attend, but she did. And afterward, according to her letter, she felt watched. Now pause. Let that settle in. Have you ever walked out of a room and felt like someone was looking through you instead of at you? That eerie prickle at the back of your neck? That's the exact language Diana uses. And Charles Spencer realizes the meeting she referenced happened 48 hours before her death. 48 hours. 2 days. Less than a weekend. And suddenly, the timeline he'd always accepted begins to crumble. Because the public version of Diana's final days was simple, linear, predictable. But her letter suggests a break in the chain, a moment where something shifted. And that's where Chapter 2 begins to spread its wings. Charles Spencer doesn't remember the exact date of the meeting at first. He's overwhelmed, emotional, distracted by the pain of seeing her handwriting again. But then he does what any desperate brother would do. He starts digging. Searching through old calendars, old schedules, old phone logs, old newspaper clippings, anything that might remind him where Diana was on the day she wrote that line. And when he finds it, everything inside him collapses. Because Diana attended a private engagement she never told the press about. One that was not on her official royal schedule. One that wasn't authorized. One that only a select few knew even took place in this dramatized world. And that engagement wasn't a charity event, or a fashion appearance, or a meeting with friends. It was a conversation with senior palace staff. Unofficial, off the record, behind closed doors, completely undocumented. And now Charles Spencer begins to understand the one thing that had haunted Diana in her final weeks. She felt exposed, vulnerable, like something was happening behind the scenes, and she didn't know who to trust anymore. Before we continue, let me ask you something directly. If someone you cared about told you they felt unsafe, really unsafe, would you brush it off? Would you assume they were emotional? Would you underestimate the threat because you didn't want to believe it was real? Most of us would. It's human. It's easier to believe emotions fade than to believe danger lurks. But now, looking back, Charles regrets everything he dismissed. And that regret is what pushes him further. He begins reconstructing Diana's final timeline the way investigators never did. Not with official statements or public logs, but with her private communications. Letters, notes, calls, messages she left with friends. And as he pieces them together, contradictions start showing up like cracks in the wall. For example, Diana told one friend she planned to travel the day after the meeting, but she told another she intended to lay low for a few days. Why? Why the sudden indecision? Why the shift in plans? Why the mixed signals? Because, according to her letter, someone changed the environment. That's the phrase that stops Charles Spencer cold. Someone changed the environment. What does that even mean? A new advisor? A new restriction? A new threat? The letter doesn't explain. It only hints. And the more Charles stares at that line, the more he realizes how many small details he missed back then. Details that would have seemed irrelevant at the time. For instance, a phone call Diana received that she never mentioned again. A message she deleted before anyone read it. A dinner she canceled last minute with no explanation. A journalist she promised to call back, but never did. A security officer she reported feeling uncomfortable around. And suddenly, the timeline feels less like a sequence of events and more like a scrambled puzzle. Let me ask you, have you ever tried to assemble something without realizing you're missing pieces? That's where Charles is now. Every detail he uncovers leads to another question. Every question leads to another contradiction. And every contradiction makes the events of those final 48 hours feel more suspicious, not in a criminal sense, but in a human sense, in a psychological sense. Because here's the emotional truth this chapter digs into. Diana felt something was off, something she couldn't articulate, something she didn't understand, something that made her feel observed and constrained in ways she hadn't experienced before. And the timeline she left behind reads less like a schedule and more like breadcrumbs leading to an uncomfortable truth. But now comes the twist, the one that forces Charles Spencer to confront the possibility that someone else noticed the shift in Diana's behavior. Someone inside the palace. Someone who had access to information Charles never knew. In this fictional narrative, that person was a senior advisor, a man who, decades later, would admit to a conversation that doesn't appear in any official record. A conversation where Diana asked a pointed question. Why now? Simple words. But loaded. Charged. Urgent. Why now? And according to this fictional insider, the advisor didn't answer her. He couldn't. Because he knew whatever was happening around her had gone beyond palace protocols, beyond PR, beyond anything he understood. The energy was shifting, and Diana felt it. At this point, Charles Spencer realizes the timeline he remembered, the one the world accepted, was incomplete. Not wrong, but incomplete. Built on assumptions. Missing context. Missing nuance. Missing the emotional undercurrent Diana tried to document before it was too late. And if the timeline didn't add up, what else didn't? This is when Charles returns to the letter. And that's when he sees it. A detail so small it's almost invisible. A date. A timestamp. A note written in Diana's rushed handwriting. Check the car. 3 words. 3 devastating words. 3 words that send Charles into a spiral of shock, confusion, grief, and fury. Because why would Diana mention the car 2 days before the crash? What did she notice? What did she fear? What did she think would happen? The timeline fractures here. This is the moment Charles realizes Diana wasn't predicting her death. She was reacting to something that already happened. Something he overlooked. Something the world overlooked. Something that adds a new layer of mystery to everything that follows. So now we have a new question, and this question drives the entire rest of the chapter. What happened to Diana's car in the 48 hours before the crash? And if she noticed something alarming, why didn't anyone else? Why didn't anyone listen? Why didn't anyone investigate? Have you ever had a small instinct, a quick moment of dread, that later turned out to be right? Imagine that instinct written down in Diana's own handwriting. Imagine seeing it decades later. Imagine realizing you never asked her what it meant. That's where Charles stands now. Haunted, grieving, determined. And that determination pulls him deeper into the timeline, into the inconsistencies, into the silences, into the last-minute changes that suddenly feel less like coincidences and more like signals. For example, according to one friend, Diana mentioned she didn't like the way things were moving around her. No one knew what she meant. No one followed up. But now Charles wonders, was she talking about people? Or was she literally referring to objects, vehicles, protocols, something misaligned? And here is where the despair hits him. He waited too long. He buried the letter. He ignored the signs. And now, almost 30 years later, he's forced to confront a truth so painful he can barely speak it out loud in this fictionalized story. Diana tried to warn him, and he didn't listen. But before he can process that heartbreak, something else surfaces, something that shatters what he thought he knew about the night of the crash. A witness, one who was never interviewed, one who saw something no one recorded, one who claims the car Diana traveled in had drawn attention earlier that day. Not because of paparazzi, not because of fans, but because someone inspected it. Not a mechanic, not hotel staff, someone in a suit, someone calm, someone official-looking, someone who left without explanation. And this anonymous witness describes one more detail that makes Charles Spencer's blood run cold. The man kept checking his watch. Now what does that mean? Why would someone check the car then check the time? Was it simple coincidence? Harmless curiosity? Routine hotel procedure? Or was it something else entirely? That's the question that splits this story wide open. Charles Spencer realizes he doesn't have a timeline. He has 2 timelines. The public one, polished, consistent, digestible. And the private one, chaotic, emotional, fractured. And they don't match. Not even close. So now you, the listener, must ask yourself, which timeline matters more? The official one, or the one Diana was trying to leave behind like a trail of breadcrumbs? Because as Charles moves deeper into this mystery, he uncovers something even more disturbing. Diana wasn't the only one who felt something was wrong. Someone else did too. A member of her security detail. And what he saw on the day of the crash is the detail that will lead us into the next chapter. A detail that changes everything. A detail he swore he'd never talk about. Until now. What did the member of Diana's security detail see on the day of the crash? And why did he swear he'd never talk about it? That's the question echoing like a warning siren as we step into Chapter 3. But let me start with something you may not expect. The first person to truly panic when whispers of Charles Spencer's revelations reached the palace wasn't King Charles. It was Camilla. And here's your mini hook. What if Camilla's reaction wasn't fear of guilt, but fear of history repeating itself? Fear of a narrative she thought had died long ago roaring back to life with claws sharper than ever? Because that's exactly what happens. So ask yourself this. What would you do if a story you thought was buried forever suddenly resurfaced in a way that threatened everything? Your reputation, your marriage, your sanity, your peace? Would you stay calm? Would you speak strategically? Would you pretend not to care? Or would you react so instinctively, so impulsively, that even the people closest to you would freeze in place and wonder what you knew that they didn't? Because in this fictional universe, when Camilla hears that Charles Spencer is not only talking but referencing a letter Diana wrote in fear, she reacts in a way that startles even the palace staff. She drops the teacup in her hand. Not intentionally, not dramatically, reflexively, because in that moment, the truth hits her. Diana's story is about to be reopened, and Camilla knows better than anyone what that means. Let's slow down for a second. You need to feel this moment, not rush through it. Imagine Camilla sitting in a quiet palace room. A morning meeting. Soft lighting. Fresh flowers arranged just so, because palace life is built on the illusion of calm. An aide enters with a hesitant look. Camilla notices the look before she hears the words. Bad news always arrives through the eyes first. Ma'am. Charles Spencer is speaking publicly. Camilla stiffens. She tries to brush it off. She asks, about what? With the kind of tone that implies she doesn't want the answer. The aide continues. He mentioned a letter. From Diana. That's when the teacup falls. And that's when the room goes silent. Now, if you're sitting there thinking, why would she react so strongly to a letter? I want to bring you into her emotional reality. Because even in fiction, the psychology matters. For decades, Camilla's life has been shaped by Diana's ghost. Not literally, but through public perception, through comparison, through decades of headlines casting her as the other woman, the villain, the homewrecker, the intruder. She knows how quickly narratives form. She knows how slowly they die. She knows how the public loves a martyr. And she knows how the public loves a villain. And the idea that Diana wrote down fears, warnings, and suspicions? The idea that people might twist those fears into accusations? The idea that Charles Spencer might imply the palace environment harmed his sister psychologically or emotionally. That terrifies her, not because she's guilty of wrongdoing in this dramatized world, but because she knows the public is ready to believe anything if it fits the story they already tell themselves. So Camilla asks, quietly, what was in the letter? The aide doesn't know. Nobody knows. But that doesn't matter. Because what Camilla fears most isn't what the letter actually says. It's what people will think it says. And just like that, her mind goes spiraling back in time, to the years when Diana's interviews dominated the airwaves, when the public adored one woman and despised the other, when every headline felt like a court verdict and every rumor felt like a knife. And this is where the emotional contradiction kicks in. Because while the world imagines Camilla as cold, composed, calculated, the truth, in this fictional universe, is far messier. She feels guilt. She feels regret. She feels fear. She feels the weight of decades of public disdain pressing down on her. And the idea of re-entering that battlefield? It breaks her. Now, let me pause and ask you something directly. Have you ever been haunted by something you didn't even do? Haunted not by actions, but by perceptions? Ever had a moment where the world told a story about you that wasn't true, but no matter what you said, nobody believed you? That's where Camilla lives. That's her psychology. And when Charles Spencer threatens to reopen this chapter of Diana's life, it feels like stepping back into a nightmare she barely survived the first time. So, Camilla does something she rarely does behind palace walls. She panics. Not loudly, not theatrically, but quietly, internally, in a way that hits harder than shouting. She demands, "Where is Charles?" The aide hesitates before replying. "He's speaking with advisors, ma'am. He is upset." And that's when Camilla realizes something that sends a chill through her entire body. If Charles Spencer is emotional, and if Charles, the king, is already upset, then the public narrative is about to slip out of their hands. Camilla knows Charles better than anyone. She knows fear in his eyes. She knows frustration in his voice. She knows when he's hiding something, not something criminal, but something emotional, something raw, something he hasn't processed, even decades later. And if this letter forces him to confront old wounds, if this revelation threatens to reignite the emotional chaos he buried, he won't be able to handle it. That terrifies her even more. So she does what she always does when she panics internally. She calls him, not through aides, not through protocol, directly. But here's the twist. He doesn't answer. And that's when Camilla's fear shifts into something sharper. Because if Charles is avoiding her, it means he's spiraling. And when Charles spirals, the palace spirals. This fictional palace runs on emotional balance. A wobble at the top becomes an earthquake below. So Camilla storms through the corridor, not dramatically, but with purpose, heading straight to the king's private office. And the moment she enters, the energy hits her like a wall. Charles is pacing, agitated, breathing too quickly, talking to himself. He doesn't see her at first, and when he finally does, his eyes tell her everything. He's not angry. He's terrified. What does Spencer know, he demands. What is he saying? What did Diana write? Why now? Why bring this up now? Camilla tries to steady him, but the truth is she's unraveling too, just in a quieter way. And here's where the story gets emotionally rich. Camilla's fear isn't about blame. It's about being blamed. She knows the world still carries a deep loyalty to Diana. She knows the world is always ready to turn on her. She knows that one misunderstanding can ignite global outrage. And if the public believes the palace environment hurt Diana in any psychological or emotional way, it wouldn't matter what actually happened. Camilla would become the villain again. The press would resurrect every old headline, every old rumor, every old interview, every old comparison. She'd be dragged back into a war she thought had ended decades ago. So she looks Charles directly in the eyes and asks the one question she's terrified to voice. "Do you think Spencer found something dangerous?" Charles freezes, and what happens next surprises even her. He whispers, almost too quietly to hear, "Yes." And that one word, that whisper, detonates everything. Because Camilla realizes that Charles isn't afraid of public backlash. He isn't afraid of headlines. He isn't afraid of history resurfacing. He's afraid of what the letter will make him confront inside himself. Something about Diana's final months. Something he never dealt with. Something he buried under duty, silence, and time. And if he has to face it now, he might break. That's when Camilla does something unexpected in this fictional universe. She steps closer, lowers her voice, and asks, "What did you hide?" Charles looks away. He doesn't answer. Not because he's guilty of wrongdoing, but because he's guilty of emotion. Emotion he never expressed. Emotion he never admitted. Emotion that Diana carried alone. And Camilla sees it. For the first time in decades, she sees how deeply the past still wounds him. And that's when she makes a decision, a dangerous one. She decides to confront someone she never planned to confront. Someone who knew Diana. Someone who heard the same fears. Someone who kept silent too. Someone whose version of events might expose more than anyone in the palace is ready to handle. But who that person is, and what they reveal, is the moment that launches us into the next chapter. Because Camilla's confrontation won't just shake the palace. It will expose a detail the public never knew. A detail Diana confided to someone other than her brother. A detail that makes the letter even more terrifying. And it all begins with a phone call Camilla makes behind Charles's back. The call that changes everything. The call no one expected. What do you think happens when a man who has spent his entire adult life hiding his emotions suddenly finds himself cornered by them? What happens when someone who has built an entire kingdom on composure, protocol, and carefully measured silence is forced to confront a past he's spent decades trying not to remember. That's the moment we walk into now. And let me warn you up front. This isn't the polished public version of King Charles. This is the private version, the raw version, the version no camera ever sees. The version even his closest advisors fear might emerge when the pressure becomes too much. The version that surfaces the moment Camilla leaves the room to make that secret phone call. The call she didn't tell him about. The call she didn't want him to overhear. The call that signals how much control he's losing. And here's your mini hook. What if the version of King Charles the world never sees is the real one? The man who isn't afraid of guilt, but terrified of grief? Because that's what this chapter exposes. A man who isn't cracking because he has something to hide, but because he buried too much for too long. Let's dive in. The moment Camilla walks out of his office, Charles feels the shift. He feels the air stiffen around him. He feels the silence expand like a pressure chamber. He feels the weight of the unspoken, the unresolved, the unhealed, pressing into his ribs like an unseen hand. This is the part of the story where the contradictions deepen, because while the world imagines him as rigid, icy, detached, the truth, in this fictional universe, is painfully ironic. Charles feels too much. Always has. Always did. And it's exactly that intensity, not cruelty, not indifference, that has haunted him since the day Diana died. He walks to the window. His pacing stops. He looks out at the courtyard below, the staff moving like clockwork, the guards stationed with iron discipline, everything clean, precise, orderly. And yet inside his chest, chaos, pure emotional chaos. He repeats the same phrase under his breath, over and over, as if trying to make it less true. It was never supposed to happen this way. What does that mean? What is he referring to? You're about to find out. But first, let me ask you something. Have you ever tried to outrun a memory? Have you ever shoved something so far back into your own mind that you convinced yourself it was gone, only for it to slam back into your life years later, sharper than ever, triggered by one small detail? That's exactly what happens to Charles when he hears that Charles Spencer is speaking publicly. Because the letter isn't just a threat to the monarchy's image, it's a threat to his emotional stability. And Camilla knows this. That's why she left the room. That's why she made the call. That's why she acted before he could spiral further. But Charles doesn't know any of that yet. He only knows one thing. He cannot control this narrative. Not this time. Not this story. Not this ghost. And that terrifies him. He clenches the edge of his desk. His knuckles turn white. His jaw tightens. His breathing becomes uneven. This is the breaking point. Not the loud, dramatic kind people expect from powerful men, but the quiet, internal implosion that happens when a lifetime of suppressed emotion finally demands attention. He whispers Diana's name, not angrily, not resentfully, but painfully, as if saying her name reopens a wound that never healed. And that's when an advisor enters the room without knocking, something that nearly sends Charles into a rage. Not because of the intrusion, but because he's moments deep into a memory he wasn't prepared to revisit. The advisor looks rattled, nervous. He clears his throat. He says, "Your Majesty, I've received word that Charles Spencer is preparing to release a recording." A recording. The word hits the room like a grenade. Charles's entire body tenses. For a moment, he doesn't move. He doesn't blink. He doesn't breathe. And then he turns slowly, very slowly, to face the advisor. "What recording?" he asks. And the advisor hesitates. Never hesitate in front of a king, unless you're terrified of the truth. The advisor tries again. "We don't know yet, but it appears to involve Diana." And the letter. The temperature in the room seems to drop. The advisor swallows hard. He regrets speaking instantly. And Charles takes a step forward, not threatening, but desperate. "What else?" Charles demands. "What else do you know?" And this is where the emotional tremor ripples through the palace staff. Because King Charles is not a man who usually seeks answers impulsively. He is measured, deliberate, practiced. But right now, he's unraveling. The advisor stammers. There are suggestions that the recording may contain her voice. Diana's voice. Two words that break something inside him. Because in this fictionalized narrative, Charles has spent decades trying not to hear her voice in his mind. The voice from interviews, from phone calls, from arguments, from laughter, from the life they once shared before everything fell apart. He closes his eyes. His breathing falters, and the advisor doesn't know what to do. "Your Majesty?" he asks, stepping forward tentatively. But Charles doesn't respond, because he is no longer standing in the office. He's no longer in the palace. He's back in a memory he never wanted to see again. A memory that starts with a phone call he received the day before the crash. A call he never told Camilla about. A call he never told anyone about. A call from someone very close to Diana. And that call contained a warning that now feels eerily connected to the letter Spencer is revealing. The person on the other end said something Charles can still hear word for word in this fictional world. She's scared, and she thinks someone is watching her. That's the sentence that returns. That's the ghost he can't outrun. That's the call he pretended wasn't serious. He said at the time, "She worries too much. She's overwhelmed. It's stress." He minimized it. He dismissed it. He moved on. And then she died. And he's lived with that guilt ever since. In this fictional universe, Charles has convinced himself that if he'd responded differently, if he'd listened more carefully, if he'd acted instead of deflecting, maybe things would have been different. Maybe she wouldn't have felt alone. Maybe she wouldn't have felt exposed. Maybe she wouldn't have felt afraid. And now, with the letter resurfacing, every suppressed memory surges back to the surface like a tidal wave he can't control. He grips the back of a chair to steady himself. His voice shakes when he finally speaks. "Find out what's in that recording. I want answers now." But the advisor doesn't move. Because he has one more thing to say. The thing he's terrified to reveal. He clears his throat. He lowers his voice. He says, "Your Majesty, Camilla already made a call." Charles freezes. A different kind of fear sweeps over him now. Not fear of the letter, not fear of the recording, but fear of what Camilla is doing behind his back. Because if Camilla is reaching out to someone without telling him, it means she believes the situation is worse than he realizes. "Who did she call?" he asks. But the advisor doesn't answer. He can't, because he doesn't know. And that realization sends Charles into a deeper panic. He storms toward the corridor, moving with a pace that startles every staff member he passes. He's not walking like a king. He's walking like a man running from something, or towards something. He needs to find Camilla. He needs to know who she spoke to. He needs to regain control. Because right now, everything feels like it's slipping. He finds Camilla in her private sitting room, phone in hand, mid-conversation. She turns and sees him. The fear in her eyes reflecting the fear in his. He steps closer. She ends the call abruptly. He asks, "Who was that?" And here comes the twist, the moment that reshapes everything. Camilla doesn't answer. Instead, she whispers, "You should sit down." Charles goes pale. "Why?" he demands. And Camilla closes her eyes. She steels herself. She looks him directly in the face. Because there's something Diana told someone else before she died. Something that was never recorded. Something no one ever mentioned. Charles's heart stops. What did she say? And Camilla whispers. She said she feared someone close to her would betray her. Charles staggers back. He looks shattered. Not because he's guilty, but because he knows exactly who Diana was talking about. And it wasn't Camilla. And it wasn't Charles. It was someone else entirely. Someone still inside the palace. And the moment Charles whispers their name under his breath is the moment everything in this story changes. Because that name, that person, is the key to Diana's fear. And the key to the entire unraveling timeline. And that revelation, whose name did Charles whisper? Who was the person Diana believed would betray her? And more importantly, how does a single name open the door to one of the most overlooked, most unsettling pieces of her final days? The driver no one ever talks about? That's where this chapter begins. Here's your mini hook. What if the person Diana feared wasn't a royal, not an advisor, not a family member, but someone embedded so quietly into her daily life that she barely noticed them at all, until it was too late? Let's step directly into the moment where we left off. Charles's lips move, but the name comes out barely above a whisper, a sound more breath than speech. A name he hasn't spoken in decades. A name he hoped he'd never have to think about again. And when Camilla hears it, her eyes widen with silent recognition. Not accusation, not suspicion, recognition. Because she remembers the man too. And suddenly, the air in the room changes, thickens, as if someone opened the door to a memory neither of them wanted to revisit. The name Charles whispered belongs to a man who, in this fictional narrative, served briefly on Diana's expanded security rota during the last stretch of her life. Not a household name, not a public figure, not someone who appeared in documentaries or interviews. A man who worked quietly in the background, unnoticed, unremarkable, except to Diana, and except for one moment in her final days. His name, in this dramatized universe, is Michael Clare. Not a guard, not a senior advisor, not a royal insider. A driver, one assigned temporarily, one whose contract began only weeks before her death, one who, according to sources Diana trusted, made her feel uneasy. This is the part nobody likes to talk about, because in the world of royalty, drivers come and go. Some are discreet, some are loyal, some know how to blend into the wallpaper. But sometimes, and this is where things get dark, one of them observes too much, learns too much, hears too much. And Diana, even at her most trusting, wasn't naive. She sensed when someone was off. She sensed when someone's presence felt wrong. From the outside, Michael was clean, polite, unassuming. But inside the palace, inside the staff corridors, whispers always follow new hires. And in this fictionalized retelling, Diana heard one whisper that rattled her so deeply she mentioned it, off the record, to someone she trusted. He watches everything. 3 words. 3 ominous words. And that same person, the same confidant Camilla secretly contacted, told her something even more disturbing. Diana requested that Michael be removed from her rotation, weeks before her death. But here's the part that twists the knife. He wasn't removed. Why? Budget? Schedule conflict? Internal miscommunication? Deliberate choice? No one knows. Not Charles Spencer. Not Charles. Not Camilla. Not the royal staff in this fictional universe. And this is where the timeline fractures even further. Because according to the source Camilla called, Diana didn't simply feel uneasy around Michael. She felt observed. She felt tracked. She felt studied. Let me ask you something. Have you ever been around someone who never says the wrong thing, never raises suspicion, never breaks protocol, yet something about them feels off? Something you can't pinpoint but can't ignore? That's what Michael represented to Diana. And now we return to the detail from Chapter 2, the detail that changed everything. A witness saw someone inspecting the car hours before the crash. Who was that man? What if it wasn't a hotel worker? What if it wasn't paparazzi? What if it wasn't a random passerby? What if it was someone Diana already feared? Let's move deeper. When Camilla reveals that Diana confided in someone else, someone who told her she feared betrayal, Charles stops breathing. His face pales. His chest rises and falls too quickly. Because the name he whispered wasn't random. It didn't come from speculation. It came from memory. A memory he fought hard to bury. Because in this fictional world, 2 days before Diana's death, Charles received a message from his staff. A message that seemed trivial at the time. A message he didn't think twice about. Temporary driver reassigned. Princess requested change. He remembers reading it. He remembers shrugging it off. He remembers assuming it had been handled. Only now, decades later, does he realize what that message really meant. Diana sensed danger. Someone ignored her. And the consequences, well, we know how the story ends. Or at least, we think we do. But this chapter is about what no one paid attention to. The tiny details that now feel like warning sirens blaring across time. Who was Michael Clare? Let's examine him more closely. Because stories like this don't unfold cleanly. Michael was new, quiet, highly recommended, overly polite, always early, never flustered, never emotional, never memorable. And that's exactly what bothered Diana. People who blend perfectly rarely do so naturally. His file, now dusty and buried, contained glowing reviews, too glowing, almost rehearsed, like recommendations copied and pasted across multiple references. And in one of the references, one that Camilla's contact remembers vividly, there was a sentence that now feels chilling. Michael is dependable, discreet, and observant. Observant. Diana underlined that word when she saw his file. The same confidant Camilla contacted said that Diana scribbled a note beside it. Too observant. And that wasn't the only note she wrote. There were others. Beside his start date. Why so last minute? Beside his assigned route. Who approved this? Beside a shift he'd picked up unexpectedly. This wasn't scheduled. Diana wasn't paranoid. Diana was perceptive. So now we have a man she found suspicious. A man who remained assigned to her despite her request. And a man a witness saw examining her car the day of the crash. But here's where the story turns again. Because Michael wasn't the only one who saw the car that day. Someone else did too. One of Diana's own security officers. The same officer who later swore he'd never speak about what he witnessed. And this brings us to the central revelation of this chapter. The officer didn't stay silent because he was protecting the palace. He stayed silent because he was protecting himself. Let's dig in. The security officer's secret. The officer, let's call him Graham in this fictional narrative, was part of Diana's rotation for years. Loyal, dependable, protective. But on the day of the crash, he saw something he couldn't explain. Something that contradicted his training. Something that contradicted protocol. Something that contradicted common sense. He saw Michael, not outside the hotel, not near the entrance, not casually walking past. He saw Michael under the car. Let that sink in. Under the car, not fixing anything, not tightening anything, not performing maintenance, just checking, methodically, deliberately, quietly. Graham froze when he saw him, because drivers don't inspect the underside of cars unless instructed. And no one instructed Michael to do anything that day. So Graham approached. Slowly, carefully, he asked, "What are you doing?" And this is the part Graham never forgot. Michael didn't flinch, didn't react, didn't seem startled. He simply slid out, dust on his hands, and said, "Just making sure everything's moving the way it should." Everything's moving the way it should. What does that even mean? A joke? A remark? A slip? A warning? Graham didn't know. But Diana's letter, the one where she wrote, "Check the car," suddenly burns through Charles Spencer's mind like fire. Because Diana noticed something too. Something subtle. Something invisible. Something only she saw. Charles Spencer connects the dots. Now, in the present day, decades later, Charles Spencer realizes the truth. Diana didn't fear betrayal from royalty. She feared betrayal from proximity. From someone physically close. Close enough to be dismissed. Close enough to be trusted. Close enough to do something unnoticed. And who is closer to a vulnerable person than a driver? Let me ask you directly. If someone wanted to observe you, learn your habits, track your movements, would they sit in an office? Would they hide behind palace walls? Would they study you from afar? Or would they sit behind the wheel of your car, waiting, watching, listening, every mile, every moment? Diana understood this deeply, instinctively, and she acted on that instinct. She requested removal. She wrote warnings. She left clues. She tried. But someone overrode her request. The question is, who? Because in this fictional narrative, Michael Clare never should have remained assigned to her. His continuing presence was not a mistake. It was a choice. But whose choice? And why? And what did Diana see that no one else did? Those questions are exactly what Charles Spencer is determined to uncover. Because he now realizes Diana didn't just sense betrayal. She predicted it. The final blow. As Chapter 5 comes to a close, Charles Spencer receives a message from his investigator, the one helping him review Diana's remaining documents and old correspondences. The message says, "We found something you need to hear. Not see. Hear. It's an audio file. Old. Damaged. Nearly lost. A recording Diana made privately. One she never showed anyone. One in which she mentions Michael by name. And in the final seconds of the recording, she says something so chilling that Charles Spencer drops the phone when he hears it. He thinks I don't notice him watching me. But the most haunting part? She says, right before the recording cuts out, "If something happens to me, start with the driver." And that sentence, that terrifying sentence, is exactly what leads us into Chapter 6. Because the truth behind that recording, and the person who helped Diana make it, will change everything. What if the last person Diana spoke to before her death wasn't the one history remembers, but someone she trusted just enough to confide in and feared just enough to protect? What if the final words she ever recorded weren't for the world, but for one person she knew would understand what she couldn't say out loud? That's where this chapter begins. And here's your mini hook. What if Diana's final phone call wasn't an accident, but a message, a warning, a clue? A final attempt to reveal the truth she sensed closing in on her? Let's step back into the moment where Chapter 5 ended, the discovery of the private audio recording. Charles Spencer is pale, shaken, sitting alone in a quiet room with the recording still echoing in his mind. "If something happens to me, start with the driver. But Diana didn't record that message in a void. She didn't whisper those words into the air. She recorded them because something had just happened. Something that frightened her enough to reach for the phone. And that's what Charles Spencer realizes now. If there's a recording, there must have been a reason. A trigger. A moment. And that moment, he believes, is connected to her final phone call. But the truth of that call is not what the public has been told. Not in this fictional retelling. Not even close. Let's go back to the night before the crash. A call made in shadow. Diana sits on the edge of her hotel bed. The night is louder than it should be. Distant traffic, muffled conversations, something buzzing that she can't quite identify. She's restless, agitated, alert. The kind of alert that comes from instinct, not logic. She checks her phone, then checks the door, then checks her reflection, catching her own expression, wide eyes, tightened jaw, brows drawn together with a tension she tries to disguise. She picks up the phone again, scrolls through the contacts, stops on one name. A name she shouldn't call. A name she wasn't supposed to call. A name that would raise questions if anyone ever found out. But she calls anyway. Why? Because fear does strange things to a person. It rearranges priorities. It rewrites boundaries. It pushes you toward the one person who once understood you better than anyone else. Even if that person is someone you shouldn't have reached out to at all. The phone rings once, twice, 3 times, and then the voice answers. Quietly, sleepily, but instantly alert when they hear her breathing. Diana? She hesitates. She almost hangs up, but the tension inside her is too great. I need to tell you something, she says softly, and I need you to listen. Now pause here for a moment. Who do you think she called? A friend? A lover? A security officer? A journalist? Her lawyer? Her brother? Or someone entirely different? Because whoever it was, they kept her secret for decades. And that's the first twist. Diana's final call wasn't to the last person the world assumed. This phone call was private, unrecorded, unacknowledged, lost to time until now. Charles Spencer didn't